Hey everybody, this is a piece by Matthew Bolton. I have other pieces by Matthew Bolton on this channel. This piece is titled The Meaning of, quote, genocide, end quote. It's from the 5th of June, 2025. I got this from academia.edu. And here's the little abstract for it. Since the attack on October 7th and Israel's war in Gaza, the word, quote, genocide has become a touchstone in public debate, a symbol of uncompromising commitment for some. It is no longer a matter of law, but an absolute moral imperative. In this article, Matthew Bolton analyzes the shift in the meaning of this term from legal accusation to ontological condemnation, and shows how its use, fueled by the theory of, quote, settler colonialism, end quote, leads to cutting off any possibility of political action against the war of destruction being waged by the Netanyahu government in Gaza. For by positing that Israel is acting on a logic of annihilation, intrinsic to Israel's very existence, the equation, quote, Israel equals genocide, end quote, becomes the axiom of an ideology that rejects any political solution to the conflict on principle. In February 2024, the British social media personality Ash Sarkar interviewed the veteran leftist U.S. Senator Bernie Sanders. And everyone knows Ash Sarkar's face. I don't know if I knew her name. Ashna Sarkar is a British journalist and libertarian communist political activist. She is senior editor at Novara Media and teaches at the Sandberg Institute in Amsterdam. She is a contributor to The Guardian and Independent. I don't know what about her is a libertarian communist. Where am I? I'll just read a bit about her writings and commentary. In Sarkar's writings and commentary, Sarkar has expressed anti-imperialist, feminist, anti-fascist, and libertarian communist views. She has taken part in anti-racist, anti-fascist, and anti-Trump protests, and in 2018 backed a hunger strike to protest against the detention of asylum seekers at Yarl's Wood Immigration Removal Center. She supported the Stansted 15's actions against deportation flights. After a clip of her telling Piers Morgan on Good Morning Britain that she was, quote, a communist, end quote, went viral, Sarkar clarified her views as libertarian communist, a, quote, long-termist, end quote, who supports the Labour Party leader Jeremy Corbyn's anti-austerity policies. That has nothing to do with libertarian communism. Sarkar has described her view on communism as being, quote, about the desire to see the coercive structures of state dismantled, but while also having fun. It's not about driving everybody down to the same level of abjection, but making aesthetic pleasures and luxuries available to all, end quote. After joining the Labour Party during the UK general election campaign in late 2019, Sarkar became closely associated in the media commentary on Corbyn's Democratic Socialist Project. Sarkar announced that she had left the Labour Party in September 2021. In 2018, Sarkar defended anti-Zionist activist Ava Jezevich, who, together with Yonatan Shapira, had painted, quote, free Gaza and Palestine, liberate all ghettos, end quote, onto a wall of the Warsaw Ghetto. Yezhovich was scheduled to speak at a Momentum conference that was running alongside the official labor conference. Sarkar wrote on Twitter that Yezhovich and Shapira's words were anti-racist, not anti-Semitic. In 2019, Sarkar said that, on reflection, she should have, quote, drawn a line between defending Ava, criticizing the coverage, and being more critical of the action itself, which I don't think was well thought out, end quote. In 2008, in a 2018 interview with Teen Vogue, Sarkar described herself as a, quote, fierce critic, end quote, of the prison-industrial complex, military-industrial complex, the expanded use of drone warfare, and the expansion of deportation under both Barack Obama and Donald Trump. Sarkar said the loss of jobs due to automation could give rise to fascism as a way of controlling the, quote, surplus disposable population, end quote. Alternatively, the extra time created by automation could liberate people to, quote, imagine different ways of living, end quote, and, quote, pursuing your passions. In 2025, she released her debut book, Minority Rule. In the book and its promotion, she criticized identity politics, believing it to divide minorities and the working class. She has a defamation lawsuit with Julie Burchill, but I won't read that. Yeah. So. That's who Ash Sarkar is. Anyway, in February 2024, the British social media personality Ash Sarkar interviewed the veteran leftist U.S. Senator Bernie Sanders. Sarkar posted a 4-minute segment of the interview on her X account. That interview segment went viral, racking up more than 8 million views. Quote, I asked Bernie Sanders 3 times whether he thinks Israel's assault on Gaza constitutes a genocide, end quote. Sarkar wrote, quote, this is what he said, end quote. To the first question, Sanders replied that, quote, what Israel is doing is absolutely disgraceful, horrible, end quote. And that he was doing, quote, everything I can to end it, end quote. Sanders said he, quote, led the opposition, end quote, in Congress to a bill which would have sent $14 billion in American aid to Israel because Sanders didn't, quote, want to see the United States complicit in what Netanyahu and his right-wing friends are doing right now to the Palestinian people, end quote. Sanders called for a, quote, humanitarian ceasefire, end quote, and negotiations to, quote, work out some kind of long-term solution, end quote. Sarkar was not satisfied. Sarkar asked again, was it a genocide? Quote, we can argue about definitions, end quote, said Sanders, but what mattered was preventing further deaths and getting aid into Gaza. Sarkar tried once more, genocide or not. Quote, we can talk about that, end quote. Sanders replied, quote, but what does that mean in real terms, end quote. What Sanders was trying to do, and Sanders repeated, was to stop American aid to Israel so that, quote, Mr. Netanyahu and his right-wing friends may decide it is not a good idea to continue, end quote, with their war of destruction. The response to the clip was savage. Sanders was, quote, craven and cowardly, end quote, quote, spineless, end quote, and a, quote, grifter, end quote. That he, quote, was dancing around the question, he, quote, was dancing around the question was so telling, end quote. Some went further. Sanders, who is Jewish and in his youth had spent time on a kibbutz, similar to the ones attacked on the 7th of October, was a, quote, Zionist, and bracket, that, and bracket, explains everything he's been doing and saying since October 7th, end quote. A week later, another video clip was posted on X showing Sanders speaking at the University of Dublin. Here, Sanders' views on the term, quote, genocide, end quote, became a little clearer. quote, when you get to the word, bracket, genocide, and bracket, you've got to be careful when you use that word, end quote. Where the hell am I? Here, Sanders' views on the term, quote, genocide became a little clearer. Quote, when you get to the word, bracket, genocide, and bracket, end quote, Sanders said, quote, I get a little bit queasy, ... and I don't know what, quote, genocide, end quote. You've got to be careful when you use that word, end quote. Sorry, I'm having some technical difficulties here. You've got to be careful when you use that word, end quote. At this time, those filming the video exploded with rage. They began yelling at Sanders, quote, it is a genocide, ... Bernie, you have funded Zionism yourself. You have funded the Israeli settler state, ... Liar, liar, genocide denier, ... You are a child killer. You are a genocide denier, ... Native Americans are still being genocided, bracket, by the USA, end bracket. I have never heard you speak once about genocide, end quote. Sanders has faced similar protests at his public appearances ever since. What the hell is going on with my computer? The treatment of Sanders. Sorry, 1 second. Sorry, I know this is annoying. My computer's being a dick. Big old stinky dick. The treatment of Sanders, a man who most single-handedly put the idea of democratic socialism back on the agenda in the USA, encapsulates the totem role the concept of, quote, genocide has come to play in the opposition to Israel's war in Gaza. Here we have a leading politician who is forthright in his rejection of the war and who is acting concretely against the war at the highest levels of American government. Yet because he refuses to use a particular word to describe the violence he seeks to prevent, he is mocked, vilified, and excommunicated. And Sanders is not alone in this regard. The opposition to a war whose initial justice has been progressively undermined by its indefensible conduct is thus split and weakened, perhaps fatally. This raises the question, if the priority of the anti-war movement is preventing further death and destruction in Gaza, and the urgency of this demand certainly since the resumption of Israeli bombing and blocking of aid in March 2025 cannot be doubted, why does it matter what it is called? Why is it worth sacrificing the unity of the movement on the altar of, quote, genocide? On one level, the immediate take-up of the, quote, genocide, end quote, label, with the first charges issued while the dead were still being gathered from the Nova field and the kibbutzim, is simply further evidence of a general semantic inflation of the term over recent decades. From accusations that governments slow to impose COVID-19 lockdowns were committing genocide, to specious notions of, quote, trans or, quote, white genocide, end quote. The emotional power carried by the concept has made it a wearingly ubiquitous rhetorical weapon in a social media driven attention economy. Yet when it comes to the application of the concept to Israel, there is, as ever, more at stake than internet posturing. For some observers, the appeal of the concept of, quote, genocide, end quote, in this context can be explained by the opportunity it affords to engage in victim-perpetrator reversal, or Holocaust inversion, by accusing Israel, a state that rose from the ashes of an annihilated European Jewry, of genocide, of doing to others what was once done to them. Israel is placed on the same level as the Nazi regime. As Philip Spencer puts it, quote, there was always a nagging sense of guilt about what was done to the Jews. The charge of genocide wipes this guilt away once and for all. Now anyone can say that the Jews do not deserve any more sympathy because the Jews are as bad or even worse than the Nazis, end quote. Philip Spencer. I have pieces by Philip Spencer on the channel if you're curious. At the same time, for Spencer, by spuriously accusing Israel of genocide for Israel's response to Hamas atrocities, which were themselves laced with genocidal intent, quote, the concept and charge of genocide is turned on its head, end quote. Philip Spencer. The eagerness with which so many grabbed the chance to accuse Israel of genocide in the aftermath of the 7th of October surely does have something to do with the taboo-breaking thrill of inverting and thereby finally canceling out the Shoah. Just as a side note, this is an important thing that in addition to saying that Israel was committing genocide before it did a goddamn thing, people were saying that Israel was committing genocide before that. Israel's always been committing genocide. And this is just another the war is an opportunity to say that once more. So when people talk about the numbers and stuff, they've already committed to the idea that Israel's committing genocide, prior to any of prior to the response to October 7th. That's just a side note for me. For Pankaj Mishra, in a lecture delivered bizarrely as a sermon from the lectern of St. James's Church, Clerkenwell, it is Israel's war that is, quote, dynamiting the edifice of global norms, end quote, built after, quote, the Shoah, end quote, rather, say, than Putin's invasion of Ukraine, Bashar al-Assad's flagrant use of chemical weapons, or the U.S. invasion of Iraq, is no coincidence. Wikipedia says Pankaj Mishra, born 9th of February 1969, is an Indian essayist, novelist, and socialist. Pankaj Mishra's non-fiction works include Temptations of the West, How to Be Modern in India, Pakistan, Tibet, and Beyond, along with From the Ruins of Empire, The Intellectuals Who Remade Asia, and A Great Clamor, Encounters with China and China's Neighbors, and has published 2 novels. Pankaj Mishra is a prolific contributor to periodicals such as The Guardian, The New York Times, The New Yorker, and New York Review of Books, and was previously a Bloomberg opinion columnist. His writings have led to a number of controversies, including disputes with Salil Tripathi, Niall Ferguson, and Jordan Peterson. Pankaj Mishra was awarded the Wyndham Campbell Prize for Nonfiction in 2014 and the Weston International Award in 2024. Back to the text. Nor is it just chance that the terminology of, quote, concentration camp, quote, Auschwitz, quote, Warsaw Ghetto, quote, genocide, and quote, Holocaust itself has long been ostentatiously used to condemn Israel's treatment of Gaza and the Palestinian people. Sanders' quote queasiness at the use of the term by the anti-war movement no doubt stems from Sanders' recognition of this dynamic. That Sarkar too is aware of the weight of the word for Sanders is what lends the interview the uncomfortable air of a forced confession. And yet to limit the meaning of the genocide charge to Holocaust inversion is to miss something significant about the work the concept is doing in contemporary debates about Israel. The claim that Israel is committing genocide, quote, like the Nazis, end quote, is an argument made at the level of action and intent. It is, despite its gross exaggerations and projected fantasies, at root an empirical claim, which can be proven or disproven by evidence and reasoned argument. It says, there is evidence that Israel is acting in such a way that it should be found guilty of the crime of genocide. This crime has a legal definition, parenthesis, quote, acts committed with the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious people, end quote. Quote, acts committed with the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group, end quote. End parenthesis. And a juridical apparatus built to prosecute it. Generally, an accusation of genocide such as this is targeted at particular perpetrators. The specific political leaders, faction, government, or, quote, regime held responsible. Thus, aside from the radical left anti-Deutsche movement, the claim that the Nazis perpetrated a genocide against European Jews does not inevitably lead on to the argument that Germany should not exist as a state. Rather, the German state is presented as being hijacked by the radical right, who won over the population through a combination of terror and ideology, and then used the state's apparatus to commit genocide. The defeat of the Nazi regime was thus followed by a program of, quote, denazification, end quote, aimed at removing its remnants from the German state and reintegrating it into the democratic world order. This story is, of course, complicated by the division of Germany, and the, quote, success of denazification was short-lived at best, but the point is that the accusation of Nazi genocide stopped short at the German state itself. In Sanders' interview with Sarkar, Sanders repeatedly tries to make, quote, Mr. Netanyahu and his right-wing friends, end quote, responsible for the, quote, disgraceful, end quote, conduct of the war. Sanders is following here the same political logic that led to post-war denazification. The Israeli hard right is responsible for the carnage in Gaza. They should be deprived of funds, removed from power, and a new government formed, which will negotiate a settlement with the Palestinians and again integrate Israel into the democratic world order. The same argument is made by the Israeli left. In a discursive context broadly free of anti-Semitism and the threat of Holocaust inversion, some even accuse, quote, Netanyahu and his friends, end quote, of genocide. And there is certainly no a priori reason why Israeli political and military leaders could not, hypothetically, be legitimately accused of genocide today. The fact that your ancestors experienced genocidal violence might aggravate the charge, but it does not inoculate you from inflicting genocidal violence on others. Moreover, there is ample evidence that some Israeli politicians have repeatedly engaged in incitement to genocide since the 7th of October, even if a direct connection between far-right rhetoric and actions on the ground has yet to be shown. But for Sarkar and her fellow travelers, attempts to politicize the war in Gaza by focusing on the actions of particular named individuals or specific political currents are wholly inadequate, even outright dangerous. Not only does politicization bring the actions and ideology of Hamas into play, complicating a simple moral fable by attributing agency to both sides of the ledger. Once political differences between the Israeli right, left, and center are acknowledged, one is in danger of missing the fact that, And here the differences from the German case become clear. It is not the Netanyahu, quote, regime, end quote, that is the problem, but the Israeli state itself. That is, the charge of genocide to which Sarkar demands Sanders accede is not aimed at a particular Israeli government or political faction as a result of their actions. It is not, in fact, a matter of doing at all. It is a matter of being. The theoretical basis of this understanding of, quote, genocide as being rather than doing are revealed in the shouts of Sanders' Dublin hecklers. Israel is a, quote, settler state, end quote, whose ongoing genocide of the Palestinians is akin to that of the Native Americans. What is active in this concept of, quote, genocide, end quote, is not principally the discourse of Holocaust inversion, but rather that of settler colonialism. As Adam Hirsch has recently noted, the notion of genocide is fundamental to the settler colonial theory that has, from its modern origins in the Australian, quote, history wars, end quote, of the mid-1990s, now attained a dominant position within the numerous scholarly fields and political movements. One of the people who's often called, in the radical German left, there's this notion where there was this thing called the Historiker strike, I think that's how you say it, in Germany in the 80s, which is basically an attempt by right-wing politicians to relativize Nazi crimes, including the Holocaust, by saying that basically that Stalin and the communist regimes of the 20th century, particularly, I think it was particularly focused on Stalin, also killed millions of people. Therefore, that Germany shouldn't bear any special burden of guilt for the Holocaust or for World War II, and that in some way, kind of like trying to raise German the German self-understanding of the Third Reich, relativize its harms, right? That's what the Historiker strike. There's this thing called, what you might call, and I'll read an article about it eventually, but called like the Historiker strike 2.0, which is basically the idea that tries to, in order to bring to light, in order to try to like emphasize crimes associated with colonialism and imperialism, say like Germany's treatment of the Herero people in Southwest Africa. I believe it's Southwest Africa. I probably said it wrong, but or like trying to increase the degree to which those crimes are recognized by kind of like downplaying or relativizing the Holocaust as if there was not like something specific about it. There's not something specific about the Holocaust, trying to make just like generic claims that connect the colonial project to the Holocaust, in various, like, just kind of like trying to like knock the Holocaust off of its supposed like historical pedestal, right? And this usually comes from people of like the left, particularly from like post-colonial and other fields, decolonial, that kind of whole milieu. And you know the impetus for like their and I think you know, like, it is true that the Stalinist regimes did kill millions of people. I wouldn't call it genocide because they killed millions of people, because it wasn't necessarily, I mean, in the case of Khmer Rouge, that's a different story. But in the cases, even say like Holodomor, I don't think the impetus, at least from what I know about it, I mean, I can't speak, and you know, I'm not an authority on it, but say like Holodomor, where like, you know, and like other places in, I think also like Kazakhstan and like other places within the Soviet Union experienced massive starvation in the 1930s directly due to Stalinist policies, right? And that's what the Holodomor is. I don't think the Holodomor was a specific hate crime against Ukrainians, right? Especially when you consider that Stalin's successor, Nikita Khrushchev, was himself a Ukrainian. I don't think that there's, in that case, I think it's a crime, obviously, in that period, a rather unprecedented crime. Or I guess there's precedence for it, but the scale of it being rather unprecedented, and the dynamics by which it occurred being, but that was like not a specifically targeted like extermination of a people. So I think drawing emphasis to the Holodomor and drawing emphasis to the crimes of colonialism and the murderous way that the German Empire, for instance, operated in Africa and in particular times, right? I think that's extremely important to, and I don't think no one has any wish to deny that. But when you try to engage in this kind of relativization, you're turning world historical tragedies into pissing contests, right? It just like the notion of trying to improve the image of Stalinist Russia by comparing it favorably to Nazi Germany, or doing the opposite, trying to use the downplay or like relativize the crimes of the Nazis in order to emphasize the crimes of Stalin. I think those are that's like a disgusting way of like organizing your thought, and I think it is very socially harmful. Anyway, just as a side note, I believe that the Australian history wars, like I think it's no coincidence, I think that there was that kind of like in order to like emphasize like the violence done by the settlement of Australia to the Aboriginal people of Australia, to kind of downplay the specificities of the Holocaust. Kind of just like, oh, it's just another history of like, well, just another long history, another event, just part of the world colonial order or something like that. But I think like a big person who's like the people that use the term historic or strike 2.0 criticize that concept. It's a polemical concept. I think one of the big people they like buck against is Dirk Moses, who's one of the people who kind of like tries to like open the term genocide to mean just like state violence in general, which of course highlighting state violence against indigenous people is important. No one would dispute that, but kind of like in a way that's a little bit like flattening, or kind of like, and especially anyway, I'm sorry, I'm rambling too long. No one gives a shit what I have to say, but I'm just thinking out loud to myself. As Adam Kirsch has recently noted, the notion of genocide is fundamental to the settler colonial theory that has, from its modern origins in the quote history wars of the mid-1990s, now attained a dominant position within numerous scholarly fields and political movements. And Wikipedia says, the history wars was a term used in Australia to describe the public debate about the interpretation of the history of the European colonization of Australia and the development of contemporary Australian society, particularly with regard to the impact on Aboriginal Australian and Torres Strait Islander peoples. The term, quote, history wars, and quote, emerged in the late 1990s during the term of the Howard government, and despite some efforts by some of Howard's successors, the debate is ongoing, notably reignited in 2016 and 2020. The, quote, history wars, and quote, are often regarded as a culture war, not to be confused with the historical Australian frontier wars, which are an important subject of the debate. The history wars have played out as a cultural conflict between key figures in the Australian political and media landscapes. The term largely refers to the extent to which the history of European colonization post-1788 and government administration since Federation in 1901 may be characterized as having been a relatively minor conflict between European settlers and indigenous Australians, and generally lacking in events that might be termed, quote, invasion, quote, warfare, quote, guerrilla war, quote, conquest, or, quote, genocide, and generally marked instead by humane intent by government authorities, with damage to indigenous Australians largely attributable to unintended factors such as the unintentional spread of infectious diseases from Europe rather than to malicious policies, or an invasion marked by violent frontier conflicts and guerrilla warfare between European settlers and indigenous Australians, involving numerous clashes between Aboriginal people and the new settlers as a result of the former's food gathering practices being at odds with new land use practices based on agriculture and capitalism, a situation which has been argued to have evolved into a pan-Australian, quote, genocide of indigenous Australians, end quote, which continues to affect Aboriginal people today. The history wars also relate to broader themes concerning national identity, as well as methodological questions concerning the historian and craft of researching and writing history, including issues such as the value and reliability of written records of the authorities and settlers and the oral tradition of the indigenous Australians, along with the political or similar ideological biases of those who interpret them. One theme is how British or multicultural Australian identity has been in history and today. At the same time the history wars were in play, professional history seemed in decline, and popular writers began reclaiming the field. Sorry for that detour. I feel like I talked for way too long, trying to recall some things that I remembered. Anyway, according to the theory, what distinguishes settler colonies like Australia, the USA, and Canada from the, quote, extractive colonialism of British India or French Algeria is the way in which the latter, the, quote, natives, are needed for their labor. In the former, they just get in the way and are therefore ripe for genocide. For the British-Australian anthropologist Patrick Wolfe, one of the founding fathers of settler colonial theory, a, quote, logic of elimination, end quote, underpins virtually everything a settler colony does from the initial moment of, quote, invasion. Elimination of the, quote, natives, quote, is an organizing principle of settler colonial society rather than a one-off, parenthesis, and superseded, end parenthesis, occurrence, end quote. Patrick Wolfe. And let's look up who Patrick Wolfe is. Patrick Wolfe lived from 1949 to 2016 and was an English historian and scholar who lived and wrote in Australia. Born into an Irish Catholic and German Jewish family in Yorkshire, England, his works are credited with establishing the field of settler colonial studies. Patrick Wolfe also made significant contributions to several academic fields, including anthropology, genocide studies, indigenous studies, and the historiography of race, colonialism, and imperialism. Back to the text. At the most extreme end of the settler colonial continuum of, quote, elimination, end quote, stands the act of bodily extermination. But it goes far beyond this. For Lorenzo Veracini, the Australian editor of the journal Settler Colonial Studies. The singular logic of what he terms, quote, transfer, extends all the way from physical, quote, liquidation and pushing, quote, bodies, across borders, end quote, that is, ethnic cleansing, to, quote, transfer by assimilation, end quote, offering citizenship to, quote, natives, and even, quote, diplomatic transfer, end quote. The establishment of, quote, sovereign or semi-sovereign political entities, end quote, independently controlled by the, quote, natives, end quote. Lorenzo Veracini. Wikipedia says Lorenzo Veracini is a historian and professor at Swinburne University of Technology's Institute for Social Research, or Swinburne University of Technology's Institute for Social Research. Lorenzo Veracini is the editor-in-chief of Settler Colonial Studies and has been a key figure in the development of the field of settler colonialism. Lorenzo Veracini's book, Settler Colonialism, A Theoretical Overview, was described as quote, comprehensive though succinct, end quote, probably the best justification of the imperative to view settler colonialism as significantly different from traditional or classical colonialism, end quote. End footnote. Or, excuse me, back to the text. Once this radically distended concept of, quote, elimination or, quote, transfer, end quote, has been grasped, including the equivalence it seems to draw between physical annihilation, citizenship, and the establishment of, quote, sovereign political entities, end quote, it becomes clear that once the status of, quote, settler state, end quote, has been assigned, there is nothing that state can do which is not either explicitly or implicitly eliminationist. As Kirsch puts it, quote, the ideology of settler colonialism proposes a new syllogism. If settlement is a genocidal invasion, and invasion is an ongoing structure, not a completed event, then everything, parenthesis, and perhaps everyone, in parenthesis, that sustains a settler colonial society today is also genocidal, end quote. Adam Kirsch. Genocide makes up the essence of the settler state. Genocide is the state, and the state is genocide. It follows that there is nothing that can be done to salvage a settler colonial state. While a, quote, extractive colony, end quote, run by a minority of settlers can be overthrown through an anti-colonial national liberation movement, the remains of an eliminated, quote, native, end quote, people cannot destroy a long-established state in which, quote, settlers, end quote, make up the vast majority of the population. Unlike the post-Nazi German state, which could at least attempt to make some kind of reparations for its genocidal actions, the only reparations a settler colonial state can make for its genocidal being is its abolition. Opposition to settler colonialism and its genocidal essence is by definition all or nothing, and this means in concrete political terms, it is invariably nothing. It is, as the infamous tweet put it, quote, merely, quote, vibes, essays, papers, end quote. There is one, quote, settler state, end quote, however, where the prospect of abolition appears to be tantalizingly in reach. Israel. While a modern settler colonial theory is a thoroughly Australian production, it is possible to trace a subterranean origin story in which Israel provides the template for the settler colonial model. Certainly the works of the 1960s PLO theorists, such as Fayez Sayegh, I don't know if I'm saying this person's name right, contain elements of the, quote, logic of elimination, end quote, which would be later be formalized by Wolff and Veracini. One of the things I'm curious to know about, and I don't know if this is true or not, but I think that, I'm not sure, I heard that the PLO in their charter actually did have ethnic cleansing in its charter. I'm not sure about that. That's just something I've heard. So, for instance, when people talk about like, oh yeah, like that, like a lot of the times. I mean, if this is true, it has very, very big consequences, right? Because like a lot of times when people talk about Israel, they're like, oh well, if Hamas is so bad, it's really Israel's fault because Israel focused all of its energies and its repression on fighting like the secular forces, the secular Palestinian nationalist forces, and in certain ways like allowing Hamas in some capacity to gain greater influence and power. At least how I understand a lot of the arguments. But if it is the case that the PLO did favor some form of ethnic cleansing, and now that ethnic cleansing doesn't mean just like it should be said that, to my understanding of this, and this might be wrong, so don't take my word for it. But the thing I just heard, like at the corner of my ear, was that the PLO wanted to remove from Israel all Jews that weren't from the area, which meant like a lot of people. So like especially, and not just people from Europe, right? But people from, especially after the 800,000 or so people that were forced in some capacity or another. Whether they're forced is like the perfect term for it. I think there's like it's kind of a more heterogeneous phenomenon than that word would use. But either way, left the places in the Middle East and the Maghreb to come to to move to Israel. So that includes not just people from Europe. People were literally fleeing very lethal persecution, not just in the Holocaust, but prior. Not to say that the Holocaust was already happening before the Holocaust was happening or something like that. But the thing that I heard, and this might just be hearsay and might be just a myth, and if it is a myth, then I'm propagating a dangerous myth, so take what I'm saying with caution. But if it is the case that the secular opposition shared with, or the secular like armed struggle shared with, or had the opinion that one of its duties was to remove non-indigenous Jews from the area, deport them basically, and of course, when you're deporting massive populations like that, it's not going to be pretty by any of the stretch of the imagination. If that is so, it lends I feel like it has consequences for like because right now the big players is Hamas, right? So what does it mean for like the other people who have other anti-Zionist armed struggle groups from Palestine? It seems like it would have big implications. But anyway, Fayez Sayegh was an Arab-American diplomat, scholar, and teacher. He was one of the most significant scholars who developed various analyses on the Palestinian resistance movement against Zionism. Back to the text. Certainly the works of the 1960s PLO theorists such as Fayez Sayegh contained elements of the, quote, logic of elimination, end quote, that would later be formalized by Wolff and Veracini. In any event, the latter certainly wasted no time in applying their, quote, structure, not event, end quote, model to Israel. Its formation in relation to what were increasingly described as the, quote, indigenous, end quote, Palestinians. The use of, quote, indigenous here is not in general criteria. That is, the claim is not that Palestinians have been on the land since, quote, time immemorial, end quote, in the manner of Australian Aborigines or Native Americans, parenthesis, although this dubious assertion is increasingly common in popular discourses, end parenthesis. Rather, Palestinian indigeneity is understood here in relational terms. Palestinians are indigenous because Israelis are settlers. Palestinians are indigenous because Israelis are settlers. The concept of, quote, indigeneity, end quote, therefore makes up the third element of the settler-colonial syllogism. One cannot say Israeli, quote, settler, end quote, without saying Palestinian, end quote, indigeneity, nor, quote, genocide, end quote. I'm going to repeat that sentence again. The concept of, quote, indigeneity therefore makes up the third element of the settler-colonial syllogism. One cannot say, Israeli, and quote, settler, end quote, without saying, Palestinian, and quote, indigeneity, end quote, nor, quote, genocide, end quote. Where am I in this reading? I might have to split this in two. Not quite yet. The attempt to force the history of Israel into the Australian model was not without its struggles, however. As Benjamin Wexler has noted, Patrick Wolf, was obliged to acknowledge a series of distinct features of Jewish settlement in the Middle East that distinguished it from that of European settler colonialism elsewhere. Use Benjamin Wexler. I'm not sure who this is referring to. Anyway, as Benjamin Wexler has noted, Wolf was obliged to acknowledge a series of distinct features of Jewish settlement in the Middle East that distinguished it from that of European settler colonialism elsewhere. Jewish settlers, Wolf admits, had no colonial, quote, mother country, end quote, from which they moved. Up until the 1947-48 Arab-Jewish wars, Jews legally purchased land rather than, quote, invading, end quote, and taking it by force. In the Jewish case, uniquely, an independent national identity preceded rather than followed settlement. The choice of land was not based on economic or political happenstance, but deeply connected to the identity of the settlers, an identity shaped by a historical narrative of prior expulsion from the very land in which they now sought to, settle. Jewish settlement was initially limited by the desire for territorially contiguous parcels of land, rather than the American or Australian model of expanding, quote, frontier, end quote, settlement, and it was characterized by collective land ownership rather than private property. For his part, Verasini argues that Israel differs from the U.S. and Australia because Israel is an incomplete settler colony. The acceptance of partition, intermittent territorial wars, and the existence of Arab Israelis, or Palestinian citizens of Israel, means that Israel has been unable to, quote, supersede itself, end quote, to erase its origins. It is the partiality of the Israeli settler colonial project which makes it uniquely vulnerable to attack. Yet rather than concluding that the number and significance of these exceptions meant that the concept of, quote, settler colonialism and settler colonialism's accompanying logic of elimination is of little explanatory value when analyzing the history of Israel, Wolf came to the opposite conclusion. The various exceptions are highlighted in order to prove that, in its essence, Zionism is even more a settler colonial project, and even more committed to elimination than those which do fit neatly into the pattern. At the center of this argument are the events during the 1947-49 war that would later be conceptualized in Palestinian discourse as the, quote, Nakba, or, quote, catastrophe. For Wolf, these wartime episodes of violent expulsion and flight of Arab inhabitants within parts of what would become the State of Israel revealed the core, quote, logic, end quote, of elimination that was the hidden essence of Zionism all along. Effectively, Wolf reads history backwards from the events of the, quote, Nakba, end quote. Wolf argues that for all the prehistory of limited, non-violent legal purchases of land and all the, quote, soothing assurances, end quote, in which Zionist leaders, quote, asserted their intention to live in harmonious tandem with Palestine's Arab population, end quote. It was only contingent circumstances, the presence of the British, a relative absence of Jewish immigrants prior to the Holocaust, that prevented Zionist settlers from unleashing a campaign of violent land appropriation. The Nakba, quote, was Zionism's first opportunity, end quote, to fulfill a plan that had long been in the works, namely a, quote, more exclusive exercise of the settler logic of elimination, end quote, than anything seen in Australia and North America. The Nakba was thus a, quote, consolidation, end quote, of Zionism's innate essence, quote, rather than a point of origin, end quote. The argument has been taken up wholesale by settler colonial theorists, with the events preceding, during, and following the 1947-49 war, indeed right up to the present day, restructured so as to slot neatly within the pre-prepared conceptual architecture of Wolff's theory. The Nakba is stripped of its status as a distinct historical, quote, event, end quote, with its own specific causes and consequences, and becomes an overarching genocidal, quote, structure, end quote, that has determined the history of Israel and Palestine from the moment the first Jewish settlers, parenthesis, or returnees, and parenthesis, arrived. Indeed, the specificity of any, quote, event, end quote, within that history is erased by the need to make it fit within the totalizing logic of the settler colonial paradigm. Once this logic has been identified, any historical evidence that contradicts or counters it can and must be discounted as mere, quote, Zionist apologism, end quote. Wolff openly declares that one, quote, should not submit to the tyranny of bracket historical and bracket detail, end quote, if doing so lessens the explanatory power of the structure. The result is a circular argument in which the theorist filters the historical record of select events, which appear to cohere to a pre-established logical pattern, discards all elements which do not fit, and then asserts that those events, and thus the entire history, can only be explained by that logic. And as a question, and also as a question here, like you could also say that the 1947-49 war was, I believe it was 5 Arab states that tried to destroy Israel, to destroy the partition plan, and that when the Jews ran for their lives, that was the Arab population ran in the opposite direction. To my understanding, at least, I might be talking out my ass here. But the fact that the Nakba was like a war product, and like a product of like an attempt to destroy Israel, not the other way around. That's what people. That's one criticism. Not criticism, but something you could add to this like idea, right? This like piece is that like, obviously the massive refugee problem and the displacement of Arabs is, horrific or like a tragic, but taking it out of context is not contextualizing that it was like in the instance of war, and a war not just of about a border dispute, but the war of like Israel's the very possibility of a Jewish state being established, right? And to be clear, like these aggressions against Israel were not guided by like enlightened, ideologies. I guess I would say they were not like progressive ideologies that were guiding this invasion. So he's probably. I mean, I would assume that Bolton's probably bracketing that out, but the Nakba also is like, again, is tragic. But there's also this thing of acting as though ethnic cleansing or like changing of populations in the aftermath of a war is like something exceptional to Israel is very dubious as well. If you think of just there's other instances, many, where a war was lost, and it had effect on how the civilian population was treated by the victor, including population, forced population movements, transfers, or whatever you'd like to word. But I'm assuming Bolton's bracketing that out. I'm not really explaining what I'm trying to say very well, but just like an initial, just a thought. My marginalia. You have to live with my marginalia. Just as historical, quote, detail is rendered irrelevant in the face of the genocidal being of Israel, so too is politics. Attempting to historicize or politicize the process which resulted in the Nakba, 7th of October, or like Sanders, the, quote, disgraceful, end quote, war that followed, is to remain hopelessly marooned at the level of superficial, quote, superstructure, end quote, rather than objective, quote, base, end quote. From the settler colonial perspective, regardless of the stated subjective intentions, political beliefs, or actual actions of any given Zionist settler, their objective meaning can only be one of elimination. On the other side, no matter how clearly Hamas state their desire to erase Jewish presence in the Middle East as the representatives of an eternal, quote, indigenous, end quote, sovereignty, their actions can act at an objective level only ever be actions of righteous restoration. The erasure of political distinctions is as effective on the side of the, quote, indigenous as much as on that of the, quote, settler. Given this, the speed with which Israel was convicted and Hamas acquitted of genocidal intent in the wake of the 7th of October should be no surprise. As a settler state, Israel is always already genocidal, meaning that there was no response to the 7th of October which would not, in the end, fall under the logic of elimination. This, then, is the weight carried by the concept of genocide in the current debate. The demand that one accepts the word, the insistence that no method or means of opposing the war are permissible, that no other method or means of opposing the war are permissible, is a demand to abandon the open-ended terrain of history and politics in favor of the strictly guarded ground of essentialized meaning and inexorable logic. It is a demand that Israel be held to account not for Israel's actions, but for Israel's leaders, for the political trajectory that has led to a rampant far-right holding the reins of the government, but for its essence, its very being. At an ontological level, there is nothing an Israeli can do to purge themselves of their original settler sin, and nothing a Palestinian can do to cast doubt on the righteousness of their actions. The absolutism of this position mirrors, ironically enough, nothing more than that of the Zionist far right, for whom there is no Israeli action that cannot be justified, and no Palestinian claim that should not be immediately dismissed. Acceding to, quote, genocide, end quote, here is not then a question of evaluating this or that piece of empirical evidence about Israel's conduct of the war. It is not, in fact, a claim that can be proven or countered by evidence at all. Whether the International Court of Justice rules Israel to have committed genocide or not is of no consequence here, as demonstrated by the widespread misinterpretation of the legal meaning of the term, quote, plausible, in the International Court of Justice's January 2024 provisional ruling. Indeed, the legal definition of, quote, genocide, end quote, with its outmodest focus on, quote, intent, end quote, is increasingly derided as a regrettable obstacle, blocking the more elastic and politically amenable notion of, quote, structural genocide, end quote. Instead, the intonation of, quote, genocide, end quote, today has become a ritualistic incantation signaling wholesale acceptance of the settler indigenous genocide conceptual field, one in which each element presupposes and necessitates the next, all impervious to critique or refutation. Once adopted, the settler colonial Weltanschauung draws a veil of dehistoricization and depoliticization over the conflict, making it impossible to see the current catastrophe as anything but the inevitable expression of an irresistible logic, rather than the contingent result of a series of historical encounters, political struggles, and moral choices. But it is only by recognizing this historical contingency, and with it, the understanding that things could have been different, and still can be, that it becomes possible to assign political and moral responsibility and, like Sanders, try to find a way out. In September 24, Susan Watkins, the long-standing editor of the rabidly anti-Zionist New Left Review, was heavily criticized by the journal's readership for questioning the anti-war movement's insistence on, quote, genocide. I'm not trying to find anything on Susan Watkins. But yeah, if you don't know, the New Left Review kind of comes out of the most like Stalinist apologetic wing of British Trotskyism, right? That's what its that's what its roots are in, right? Its roots are in the work of Orthodox Trotskyist or like the theoretical presuppositions of like people like Tariq Ali and Perry Anderson and so forth, is like Isaac Deutscher, Ernest Mandel, and so on. Those are like the main people that they focus. And of course, what those main people, they emphasize the Orthodox Trotskyist position emphasizes the progressive nature of Stalinism. And emphasize more of its kind of like, kind of carry on Trotsky's kind of wishy-washy criticism of Stalinism. For instance, that's neither here nor there. That's not what this article is about. But it should be known that it's generally the leftism of New Left Review kind of sucks. Not that any of those people don't have anything ever to say that's interesting or like noteworthy, but if you carried on the degenerated worker state thesis past 1950 at the very latest, you usually were a tool. If it was ever applicable at that point. Anyway. In September 2024, Susan Watkins, the long-standing editor of the rabidly anti-Zionist New Left Review, was heavily criticized by the journal's readership for questioning the anti-war movement's insistence on, quote, genocide. Susan Watkins said that there had been, quote, ongoing disagreement, end quote, within New Left Review over the, quote, analytical precision, end bracket, end quote, of the term, quote, genocide, end quote, as a description of Israel's actions. Susan Watkins suggested that, quote, genocide had been chosen by the movement not because of the term genocide's, quote, accuracy, end quote, but to make the movement's rhetoric as, quote, emotionally powerful as possible, end quote, and therefore, quote, build the biggest movement, end quote. While acknowledging the effectiveness of this strategy, Watkins argued that choosing, quote, terms on the basis of their alarmist character is bad politics, end quote. Susan Watkins correctly recognized that the use of, quote, genocide has been, for the most part, motivated by emotion and group identification rather than sober analysis. But her conclusions should be pushed further. Approaching the Israel-Palestine conflict through the rigid formula of settler indigenous genocide is not, quote, bad politics, end quote, but opposed to politics altogether. Approaching the Israel-Palestine conflict through the rigid formula of settler indigenous genocide is not just, quote, bad politics, end quote, but opposed to politics altogether. The totalizing logic of the settler colonial model leaves no space for the working through of conflicts. The mutual recognition of shared interests or the creation of new modes of collective life that is the basis of political action. It therefore abandons politics as a potential, perhaps the only, source of concrete change, and replaces it with an abject fatalism disguised as uncompromising radicalism. To the extent that such fatalistic anti-politics can find external expression at all, it is limited to isolated acts of terrorism in which the momentary ecstasy of pure violence takes precedence over political strategy, social critique, or ethical considerations. It has little interest in contributing to Sanders', quote, long-term solution, end quote, as it does in recognizing the shared historical basis of Israeli and Palestinian identities, in acknowledging that each, quote, side, end quote, has developed historically through, rather than against, the other. The threat that this abandonment of politics and history poses to Israelis, and any Jewish person who refuses to collapse a critique of Israeli action into that of Israeli being, should not be underestimated. The murders of Yaron Lichinsky and Sarah Milgram on the streets of New York, and the celebration, I think that's in D.C., right? Or are these different people? Was it the D.C. Holocaust Museum? He is in D.C. So, and the celebration of those for whom the only fate a, quote, settler, end quote, deserves is physical, parenthesis, rather than conceptual, and parenthesis, elimination, testify to that. But if the dead end of anti-political absolutism is the only language Palestinians are permitted to understand their past and to forge a new future for themselves, it is they once again who will ultimately bear the brunt. There's some end notes here. Didn't read the end notes. See Philip Spencer's article, "The Holocaust Genocide" on October 7th. Edited in the edited volume by David Hirsch and Rosa Friedman, titled "Responses to the 7th of October: Law and Society." See Pankaj Mishra's article, "The Shoah After Gaza," published in London Review of Books in 2024. The, quote, anti-Deutsch or, quote, anti-German movement is a radical left-wing movement that emerged after German reunification. It is characterized by virulent anti-fascism, radical anti-nationalism, and notably unconditional support for the state of Israel, which it considers the only guarantor of the Jewish people's security after the Shoah. An article by Etan Nechen, the Israeli lawyer filing a landmark incitement to genocide case against Israel at the ICC. Adam Kirsch's book, On Settler Colonialism, Ideology, Violence, and Justice, published in 2024. The description for Adam Kirsch's On Settler Colonialism, Ideology, Violence, and Justice. Since Hamas's attack on Israel last October 7th, the term, quote, settler colonialism, end quote, has become central to public debate in the United States, a concept new to most Americans but already established and influential in academic circles. Settler colonialism is shaping the way many people think about the history of the United States, Israel, and Palestine, and a host of political issues. This short book is the first to examine settler colonialism critically for a general readership. By critiquing the most important writers' texts and ideas in the field, Adam Kirsch shows how the concept emerged in the context of North American and Australian history, and how it is being applied to Israel. Adam Kirsch examines the sources of its appeal, which he argues are spiritual as much as political, how it works to delegitimize nations, and why it has the potential to turn indignation at past injustices into a source of new injustices today. A compact and accessible introduction, rich with historical detail, the book will speak to readers interested in the Middle East, American history, and today's most urgent cultural political debates. Back to the text. Patrick Wolf's article, Settler Colonialism and the Elimination of the Native, published in Journal of Genocide Research, 2006. See Lorenzo Veracini's Settler Colonialism, a Theoretical Overview. The description of this book says, exploring the history and politics of a powerful and long-lasting idea, the creation of maintenance of European worlds outside of Europe. This textbook provides a broad overview of settler colonialism in the modern era. The author outlines how the founding of new societies was envisaged and practiced around the world, illustrating the specific ways in which settler colonial projects tried to establish ideal and regenerated political bodies. With an updated introduction and an additional chapter examining decolonization and indigenous recognition, the second edition brings the study of settler colonialism up to the present day. Back to the text. Footnote, it is certainly inconceivable that the haste with which the settler colonial paradigm was applied to Israel was precisely because the opportunity it offered to engage in Holocaust inversion. See Benjamin Wexler's article, The Eternal Settler, published in K Review, June 2024. See Patrick Wolf's article, Purchased by Other Means, The Palestine Nakba and Zionism's Conquest of Economics, published in Settler Colonial Studies. See Lorenzo Veracini's article, The Other Shift, Settler Colonialism, Israel and the Occupation. See Tony Dawson's article, Israel, the ICJ, and the Plausibility of Genocide, published in The Critic, 6th of November 2024. Mark Levine and Eric Chaffetz's article, Israel, Palestine, and the Poetics of Genocide, Revisited. Interview with Ariel Angel, Leaving Zion, published in New Left Review, July-August 2024. Okay. Well, that's the end of the piece. Thank you for listening. And goodbye.